So let me begin just by setting this one up, the penultimate live session of this year's West Cork History Festival. We've had, as you'll know, entwined themes this year of Ireland in 1921 and aspects of Ireland and empire, or Irish experience of empire. And this last panel, in a way, brings those together. To remind you, you can listen to a range of pre-recorded talks on some of these subjects on our website. They're up there, free to view now, all of them, and will remain there for as long as we can keep them there. And two of our panelists this afternoon, Aoife Bhreatnach and David Reynolds, are amongst the people who've made those recordings. Aoife talking about the social and economic place of garrison towns in Irish life and in the British imperial network, amongst other things. David surveying the particular pattern of English memory and amnesia about empire. And along with those two, who you're going to hear from again now, are talks from Donal Lowry, whose work has already been referred to several times this weekend, on links between thinking about Ireland's position in the 1920s and ideas of dominion status evolving theory in the British imperial network at that time. Brian E. Widdus discussing colonial objects in Irish museums. Claire Warrior on Irish involvement in polar exploration as an expression of imperial endeavour. Lar Joy talking about Irish soldiers in British imperial armies. And then closer to home in West Cork, Robert Harris talking about local echoes here of the Zulu Wars in West Cork. Patricia O'Sullivan talking about the Irishman from North Cork, who ended up making such a substantial contingent in the Hong Kong police force over many generations. And Calvary Madivan, slightly differently, in a conversation with Ida Milne about capturing something of the complexity of Irish and Indian experience of empire in fiction. Also from a non-historian's point of view, Nigel Bigger has offered his perspective on the way in which the moral record of the British Empire should be considered. And then stepping back from the focus of most of the others on the 19th and 20th centuries, and with a very different view of the moral record of empire, Jane Olmar yesterday gave us a really magisterial long view of Ireland and empire from the early modern period on, from the perspective of an early modern historian and building on her Ford lectures, but also challenging us to think about the Irish as both colonized and colonizers and what that might mean now. And so now we come to a panel which may reflect on some of those themes and consider others, because we've asked it to think about the subject of selective memories, both Irish and British ones, the similarities and the difference in those selective memories. And to chair the panel, we have, and to offer some early framing remarks, perhaps, for how we might approach those conversations, is Professor Eunan O'Halpin. He's a Bank of Ireland Professor of Contemporary Irish History at Trinity. He's a member of the government's Expert Advisory Group on Centenary Commemorations. And amongst many other things, he's the author of The Dead of the Irish Revolution, which I think is the single most frequently referred to book of this weekend. Several people have talked about it. But he's also written about a host of other topics, including British intelligence in the Second World War in Ireland and the politics of British involvement in Afghanistan, amongst other places. So he's very well positioned, I think, to help us here. And he's joined by Dr. Margaret O'Callaghan, Senior Lecturer in Politics in the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's in Belfast. And she's written very widely on Irish cultural identity and its development in the 19th and 20th century. She's the author of British High Politics and a Nationalist Ireland. And amongst other things, she's written about Roger Casement and the British Empire. And she's another member of that Northern Ireland Centenary Historical Advisory Panel, from three members of which we heard yesterday. And she could speak, I think, with authority on any number of topics that we've covered in the course of the weekend, but has chosen to participate in this panel. And with her, as I say, Aoife and David. Professor David Reynolds is Professor Emeritus of International History at Cambridge. He's perhaps the preeminent scholar of UK-US relations in the 20th century, with books like Rich Relations and works like Empire of Liberty. but he's also written recently about the state of public understanding or lack of understanding in Britain on its imperial past in the book Island Stories, An Unconventional History of Britain. And he draws out some of those themes in what he has pre-recorded for us, which is on the website. And finally, Dr. Aoife Bhreatnach, who's an independent scholar who works in Irish social and cultural history. She's a graduate of UCC with a PhD from De Montfort, and then was Irish government senior scholar at Oxford. And she's written really penetratingly about class in Irish society and about the role of marginalized communities. But today, I think the work she's going to be drawing on is her work on British imperial culture in Ireland and the way that was embodied by the military. And she's fascinating in her consideration of the physical artifacts of that period in our towns, but also the social and economic reality of that system in the period in which it existed. So those are our four speakers, and I will turn over to offer some framing remarks to Eunan.
Right, thanks very much, Simon. Just a minor correction. I've now retired from Trinity on grounds of age, so I'm no longer the professor there. And secondly, I should mention my co-author of The Dead of the Irish Revolution, Dr. Dáithí Ó who did an awful lot of the original work when he was the postdoc in the early years. Thanks very much. I'm really excited by the limited number of papers which I was able to hear. We had guests who just left this morning, but and there's some themes that arise from it which I want to touch on, some of which may be less welcome than others, but I think they're interesting. If we take even, for example, Ireland, what I consider Ireland in this context is the 32 counties, the island rather than the current jurisdiction. And yet, if you look, for example, at when the state was bidding to get its seat on the UN Security Council over the last 2 years, they issued a video which inevitably is historically a bit of a car crash, but it worked its magic. But it emphasizes Ireland's experience as a colonized thing, Ireland as a bridge between the colonized and the colonizers, Ireland, meaning the Irish state, as being, we too have suffered, we too historically have suffered, and we can help we have a history in the 50s and 60s at the UN of help in the decolonization process. And I think but we are talking on an all-island basis. So I think we want to remember that. The second thing is that we have to be really careful. I know we're talking about Ireland and the British Empire, but there are other empires. Even if we take India, as far as I can work out, the last disappearance of a segment of an imperial colonial presence in India took place. Somebody will correct me on the date. Was it in 1961 or something? Remind me, when Goa was invaded by India and the Portuguese were kicked out. Right. So even in India, and of course the French were in India as well, India isn't exclusively a sort of a British or a British and Irish imperial problem and so on. And equally, to touch on something which Nigel Bigger said in his thing yesterday about Iraq after the First World War, and Britain sort of went in, he argued faute de mieux, somebody had to go in because the Ottomans had left, but Britain also went in because Iraq was part of it saw as a key element in its imperial communications to India and to the Far East. Right. And secondly, they went in because they didn't want anyone else bloody well. In other words, imperial competition was part of the reason, rather than simply, we've got a mandate, we have to help these benighted people to become benignly, become self-governing in time. And I think part of that kind of element of Nigel's argument is to ignore, and we shouldn't ignore, the reality that there's competition going on at the same time. I don't know if you agree with me. I see that Donald has provided some information about Goa and Pondicherry. Right, thank you. So while we are focusing, I realize that on the island of Ireland, as in terms of its relationship with the British Empire and our memory of it, we have to be really careful to realize it doesn't happen in isolation. There are other empires, not all European. As somebody working on Afghanistan and India before and during the Second World War, one cannot but be conscious of Japanese imperialism and so on, and the extraordinarily, what appears to me to be racist approach they took, in particular to the Chinese, for example, in Singapore in 1942, where they more or less set out. They killed many thousands of them in a sense because they regarded them as beneath the salt and so on. So it's not. We have to be careful that what we would see now as racism and so on, and violent racism verging on extermination or genocide, it isn't particular to European empires. That should be looked at in that connection. Other sort of points I'd like to make in a general sense. Nigel Biggar was speaking, obviously, from his seat in the Civil War torn Christchurch in Oxford, but he's speaking as his background is in theology rather than in history. I think we have to think of the religious dimensions of empire. He mentioned religion as a positive force in relation to anti-slavery, although we could argue about that, right? And specifically, particularly the nonconformist conscience and so on, that everyone is, we're all God's creatures. But equally, one driving consequence of empire, of imperial expansion, is precisely as religious expansion, not only of nonconformists and the Anglican creeds, but for example, my two uncles, one of them still alive, joined the Columban order, set up in Ireland in 1918, very nationalist religious missionary order, the Maynooth mission to China, but it became very much a mission largely to British controlled parts of the British of the empire, if you like. And their mission was, yes, to help native peoples, but it's also to bring native peoples, as it were, to God, to the real God. And that involves dispossessing them of their superstitions, of their, as would be seen, say, in the 19th century, of their primitive beliefs, and bringing them into the enlightened world of whatever religion a missionary happens to be pushing. And there's a big set of ethical issues around that. Even I would argue later in the 20th century, say for Irish Catholic missionaries, particularly focusing on providing medical services, for example, particularly to do with childbirth and areas like that. So we all I'm saying, we have to think more broadly than the simply political, or than the simply British, or than the simply military, or than that there's some unique character to British imperialism. Somehow means that we should only focus on it and the British Empire without reference to other empires, because a lot of what happens, a lot of the way that the empire develops, going back to what Jane was saying, but of course, Jane was, in the 17th century, there are competitors in India, in what becomes India. There's the Dutch, there's the Portuguese, and so on. Anyway, let's not be too narrow. I know I'm being too broad. A further point I think we have to consider, and this relates to what David Reynolds' area of expertise in particular, is to look now at the invocation from Boris, not least from Boris Johnson, not only of global Britain, but a sort of a reinvention of the quote special relationship with the United States. And of course, that is presented entirely in terms of a pretty dodgy history of Anglo-American cooperation during the First World War, when America joins 3 years after the kickoff, and in the Second World War, when America joins 2 and a bit years after the kickoff, right? But that's a very Boris way of doing it. But of course, America was the first. It was never part of the colony, it's part of the Commonwealth, but it was the first breakaway colony, first substantial breakaway colony, certainly, and the most successful by far. And yet that relationship, which number 10 probably tweets about or whatever, is really seen as central to global Britain and to Boris's new way of casting, not only where Britain, that really means England, is headed in the world, but also where Britain, by which he seems to mean England, is coming from. So although again, I know we're focusing on Ireland and the British Empire, we mustn't lose sight of these wider points. A couple of other points, if I might make, I don't know if I'm going on too long, Simon. If I am, give me a signal perhaps by turning off the mic. In terms of what Donald Lowry's focus on South Africa, I think it's really interesting. What's very interesting, and he touches on it, is the absolute absence in terms of even of Irish revolutionary discourse in relation to empire and colonialism, of any real consideration of issues of color and racial justice. They simply aren't there. They understand nationalism. They understand a sort of an anti-colonial narrative. If you look at many of them, for example, Dan Breen, whose book famously, My Fight for Irish Freedom, was actually banned in India and is cited, I can quote you, Indian revolutionaries saying, and we read My Fight for Irish Freedom, right? But he himself, in his own diaries during the Second World War, writes in 1944, when things are turning against Germany, he writes, "I think the days of the white race are over. We are doomed. The Jews are going to get us, the blood-sucking Jews, and Roosevelt is going to destroy us, and the white race will be destroyed." So he's taking a very, what you say, racial or racist view of world affairs, even though he's sympathetic to Indian nationalism in another way. And that, I think, brings just an example of the contradictions inherent in a sort of a naive anti-colonial narrative, an anti-British imperial narrative, which we sometimes buy into. The same is true, of course, in terms of Indian nationalism and the inspiration it did or didn't draw from Irish revolutionaries. After all, the Indian nationalist revolution was very much, our acquisition of independence was acquired very largely through peaceful means, peaceful by the Indians, if not by the British, and by, of course, by the huge contribution that India makes in the Second World War. So those are very, very general and disorganized comments. I have also observations I'd like to make later on to some of the individual, in relation to some of the individual papers, particularly Aoife's, but I think I'll stop now and hand it back to you or Simon. Should I pass the ball to somebody else, or do you do the passing for me?
I'm very happy for you to pass the ball, Eunan, but I think it'd be interesting, since we haven't heard from her yet, to hear maybe from Margaret on some of the selective memories that she'd pick out, because you've picked several different elements there, but it'd be interesting just to hear Margaret's choice, as it were, of the most revealing selective memories.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, what I'm really going to do is, I think, talk about Roger Casement and Alice Stopford Green. And Casement matters because he is the person who's put most coherently in writing that kind of classic Irish state position in relation to colonialism, that Ireland as colonized nation, that our international policy since the 1920s has been, if you like, governed by some of the senses of Ireland's relation with the empire that Casement articulates. And I think Casement is a kind of classic voice for the conventional view of Irish nationalism, which he re-articulates in a new way in the early 1900s. And a lot, I mean, what I found quite interesting is that most of his anti-British imperial positions are voiced initially in his correspondence with Alice Stopford Green, who's his great friend. Now, both of them are from Irish Protestant families. They're from what you could loosely, perhaps, certainly in his case, call an imperial caste. Her family are Church of Ireland, very senior religious within the Church of Ireland over many generations. But the two of them together come to a profoundly anti-British imperial analysis by about 1910. So my odyssey in doing this is, while they were bonding on this anti-imperial moment, they have a kind of odd exchange in one of their correspondences. He writes to her in September 1905, "How curious you finding that Casement reference." And it's to Major General Sir William Casement, KCB. He says, "Actually, he's a cousin of my father's. The boy's name," there's a young boy who died, "was George Sackville Brown Casement. He died on the 8th of April, 1843. His father, Sir William, died on the 16th of April, 1844 at Kosipur in India after 47 years continuous service out there. Lady Casement, who was your Brown kinswoman by birth, died on the 4th of September, 1858. She and my father were great friends." So I just find it slightly ironic that these, as I sit together agreeing on how appalling the British Empire is, they go back and think about some of their ancestors who, in the case of the Casement ancestor, I mean, I think he was on the Council of India, he was quite a senior figure, and Casement says, "Lady Casement died before I was born, but I've heard my father often speak of her, that they were like all Iro-Indians. I won't use the word Anglo-Indian in this sense, full of India and the things, Aoife, of that country. Yeah. So basically, I'm interested in Casement and his critique of empire, but I'm also interested that he's formed by that empire and sees himself as out of an Irish caste who played a prominent role within that empire, certainly up to the early 19th century. And probably, I think, in talking about the Irish role in empire, we have to have some kind of a division between before and after the Union. So in other words, if we want to think about the 19th century and later, I think we think in one way, but before the analysis of Ireland that Casement puts forward is largely derived from what he sees as Elizabethan conquest to the early 19th century. And he claims in his correspondence with Alice Green that they have choices as Irish Protestants, and they have choices about how they conceptualize their sense of nationality. And he's constantly reading about South American history, about what goes on in Brazil. And his theory of nationality is that place, which is quite a popular idea at the time, affects and alters how you feel. So he says to Alice Green, you are the descendant of a Cromwellian, but your heart has gone to Ireland. I too am. And in glorifying people like Wolfe Tone, he is glorifying, I suppose, what you called colonial nationalists. So to some degree, that's how he sees himself and how he sees Alice Green. But if you go back to how he talks about his developing anti-imperialism, he says at the time of the Boer War, he's pretty sympathetic to the English position. So people then think, oh, he mugged up on Irish nationalism and developed this new view on empire in the early 1900s. But actually, he was extremely well read in histories of Ireland. He was very well read in the Elizabethan period in particular. And he writes at length about genocide in Rathlin, genocide in Munster. And in all of his writings between 1905 and his death, I suppose, in 1916, I suppose the most important essay is probably The Crime Against Europe. So his thesis is that the British Empire, it's quite a good line actually, the empire founded on Ireland by Henry and Elizabeth Tudor has expanded into mighty things. England, deprived of Ireland, resumes her natural proportions, those of a powerful kingdom. Still possessing Ireland, she's always an empire. So he writes also that it is when, working as a British consul, he's sent to the Congo to look at what Leopold is doing to the population. He claims that the Foreign Office can't understand what he's saying. They're not going to go through with it in a way in which he wants them to. And that's the point at which he goes back to his readings from the 1880s, his earlier sympathy with Parnell. He kind of gives up almost on Home Rule after the Parnell split. And what he's kind of saying is that he can understand what he's seeing of the colonial project in Africa that he was a part of. I think he does realize he is a part of it. And he says he can understand it because he understands what happened to Gaelic Ireland in the Elizabethan period. Now, okay, on grounds of race and colour, that's a deeply unsympathetic view today, but it is his argument. It was quite a profound and central argument, and it's very important, I think, for the ideology of separatist advanced Irish nationalism in the 20th century, that view of the British Empire. And I suppose when he's talking about, we talk about enlistment in the British Army, well, his line on that is quite simple, that his caste, his imperial caste, will of course be incorporated into that because they're part of the class who run the empire. And for poorer Catholics who joined the British Army in the early 19th century, his line basically is that Ireland is economically denuded by centuries of British colonialism, and it's best understood in terms of poverty. And I suppose that's why you see such anti-recruitment, anti-British Army recruitment pressure from about the late 1890s into the 1900s. That, like Casement himself publishes material in Griffith's newspaper. Arthur Griffith's newspaper, he puts a lot of money towards it. Alice Green possibly does not go as far as he goes, but the making of Ireland and its undoing, her passion for writing what she believes to be an accurate history of Ireland's experience within the British Empire is central to their view of where advanced nationalism can go in the early 20th century. And her books are extraordinarily popular. They're very widely sold. She pushes them through the Gaelic League. A lot of people read them. Years later, when somebody asked Eamon de Valera, where should I go for a history of Ireland? He says, read Alice Stopford Green. So Alice Green believes that the writing of history is an instrument of colonial oppression in Ireland, that all of the Unionist historians of her generation who come from her background are perpetuating this distortion of the past. And I just think Casement and Alice Green are a really interesting window into, I suppose, Casement is the most extreme, coherent, well-written and organized writing on Ireland and empire. And it's pretty extraordinary that it's, you know, there's no modern edition except from kind of marginal historical groups. It's well written, it's really interesting, and it's part of that collection published as The Crime Against Europe. And yeah, I think it's quite a good starting point for talking about Ireland and empire. But I'm not remotely suggesting that, you know, his views are contemporarily right on. That, you know, by the standards of his generation, he hyper-identifies with what he calls so-called native peoples, and he has that identification on the basis of comparing them with Gaelic Ireland. And he also claims that he can understand genocide and cultural destruction and language marginalization because it's seen it all happen in Ireland already, or so he says. So I'll stop for now.
Great. I take it I'm sure. Can I ask you just one question, Margaret?
Yeah.
Before I let others in, which is the obvious paradox of Casement is that he throws his arms around him, gallant allies in Europe, around Imperial Germany, which had a particularly ghastly record in Southwest Africa, an area which he could not but know quite a lot about. Is there much evidence that he saw the contradictions, or that he made a calculation that it was nevertheless better, or did he see it as morally and ethically somehow different? German.
Well, early, I mean, what the worst German atrocities are 1907, 08, are they?
I don't know the precise dates.
I think they are in the teens. I mean, he leaves Africa, I suppose, really, 304. So he kind of seems to get on okay as a British consul with German. He's quite pro-German in that period. But I don't think that he particularly, I've no idea whether he reflects or doesn't reflect on German atrocities in the first decade, but certainly his interest in a German alliance is nothing to do with a great support for Germany. It's a purely opportunistic, I mean, if you read what he writes, it's a purely opportunistic set of calculations at, from whence it might be possible to acquire arms, or where could be, useful for that purpose. So, he's not really particularly pro-German. He's very anti-German by 1916, having spent 2 years there. And presumably he must have been aware of German atrocities. As I say, I think his more sympathetic lines on the German Empire precede or whatever you want to call it, German overseas expansion, precede the 1904, 1905, 1906 atrocities of the Germans in Africa, but I wouldn't like to be held to that.
Okay, John Horn says 1904 to 1908, but well, we
Okay.
can leave that. I don't know if other members of the panel want to come in. Anybody else want to come in on this? Given the limits, please just turn on your mic and clear your throat if you do.
I'll just say one further thing apropos of what Donal Lowry's very interesting paper yesterday. I was just reading a letter from Alice, from Smuts to Alice Green, in which he says he thinks of her as a sister. So they may have these lines on empire, but at the same time, they have all kinds of sets of relationships with a variety of different figures. Okay, Smuts is, I suppose, out of her former Boer connections, but they also have close friendships with people who are British imperialists, but they also have close friendships with John O'Leary and John Francis Taylor, and that whole circle around O'Leary and Yates.
Can I just come in?
Yeah, please, Aoife, yeah.
Yeah, I've just, what I was thinking about what you said, Eunan, and also what Margaret said. Margaret mentioned pre and post union, and then you mentioned the 32 county element. That's something that's kind of quite important for the story of barracks, actually, in that the expansion of these great barracks is very much a post-union phenomenon. They do exist beforehand as a military type of architecture, and the concept existed, but there is a really dramatic expansion in the barrack network after Union. And that, I think, feeds into or comes from the sort of different relationship between elites that the Union created. It transformed the mode of clientelism and the distribution from England to Ireland of different forms of wealth, and placing barracks within Ireland was a way of bringing money, from the exchequer, the British exchequer, back into Ireland. So I think that pre-post union point is a very interesting one. And then Eunan's point about the 32 counties, the funny thing about barracks is that they totally destabilize north-south as a concept, because they are mostly Leinster and Munster. So it's a strange new border, if we were to think about this particular form of militarization. And I think that something like that might challenge how we conceptualize identity and culture within Ireland, and attitudes to the British state as well, if the experience in the north is closer to the experience of the west of Ireland than it is to, say, Dublin. So yeah, I just think that those are really interesting points within the context of what I'm doing as well.
Could I ask one question? From the Union to about 1815, there's massive fear of French invasion of Ireland. Is that the reason for the concentration of the barracks?
No, not really. As in, the French invasion of Ireland, the defense with the Martellos and with the various fortifications on the coast are an early warning signal.
But I suppose the letters between, say, Gregory and other officials in Dublin Castle are all about constantly watching out for invasion, really right up to 15.
Yes, a lot of the great barracks are started around 1903 or 1803. So they predate that scare by about 10 years. They are part of
that scare not constant from 98 onwards through the Napoleonic Wars, right up to 15.
They are part of the mobilization of this new, they're mobilizing huge numbers of troops to fight Napoleon. And in order to put them on the European battlefield, you first of all have to create regiments and create battalions, and they have to be housed, fed, and clothed before they're put onto the European battlefield. So Ireland is used as a gathering point for a lot of troops, like a holding place and a training arena And so it does indeed relate to that attempt to control Napoleon. So it is, you know, it's earlier than 1815, and then it isn't really so much about, it isn't just about Ireland being invaded, it's about the British Army mobilizing the troops to go to Europe and to do their thing.
And is there a bigger concentration of barracks in Ireland than in Britain? I mean,
Oh yes, absolutely.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I'll just maybe say what I was going to say, some of my points. One of the things about Ireland is that Ireland and India are the most garrisoned parts of the empire. And so, of course, for, you know, popular history understandings of Ireland, a lot of people would automatically say, well, of course it is, because we're, you know, we're such a restless colony and we're always trying to, you know, gain our independence, and naturally we're the most garrisoned part. Of course we are. The only problem with that is that Ireland, when the great barracks are built, which as we've said is the late 18th, early 19th century, is much more peaceful than it has ever been. I mean, it's a certain amnesia in our popular consciousness about the, you know, the early modern period, which is so extraordinarily violent, that we think that the 19th century is a terribly restless time in the colonial relationship. But these great barracks really aren't good ways of controlling space. When armies want to control, even if you look at modern, the British forces in Iraq, for example, they had great camps, but then they also had very small outposts where the soldiers are distributed in small groups to control the landscape. And the great barracks really aren't very good at controlling the landscape unless you have railways and very good roads. And let's be honest, when they're built, they have neither. So they're not building them in order to control landscape. So they're also, of course, rely on a lot of cooperation from the people around them to exist. Because if you put, you know, 2,000 people in a place and up to 1,000 horses, that's a lot of provisioning that's required. So they don't really represent, I suppose, great rebelliousness and the need to control it. And in England, there is, of course, the blind spot that Ireland has barracks at all, because it's what David was talking about in his paper about amnesia and the way that might work in popular history and beyond. But in the British conception of itself, you know, they have no standing army, they are freedom loving and, you know, promoted by democracy, but the standing army is in Ireland the whole time. And it's available for use very near to Britain as well, if they did need it in order to suppress revolution in Britain, for example. So these are home stations, and what I'm interested in these stations is as the home front of the British Empire and how that is experienced by people living and working in those towns and cities, and then also how the actual barracks are quite porous. People just walk in and out all of the time. They are far from fortified or closed spaces. And also something we maybe don't understand enough about the way that the army worked in the 19th century was how it expanded and contracted. It brought men in for short periods of time, for long periods of time. It kicks them out when the budgets are slashed. There is a constant flow of people in and out of this massive institution. So barracks are, I think, the most visible and indelible forms of imperial material culture that still exists in Ireland today. And I know Dr. Brian E. Ridis was talking about the objects in the colonial museums, the colonial objects in museums, but I think that even the streetscape in garrison towns is profoundly influenced by these once great institutions. So there are the remnants of the physical buildings, which I'll talk about in a second. There's the cultural and social legacies of the garrisons then. I mean, first and foremost, even just a very simple example from Cork City, the Barrack Street is so named because one of the first barracks in 1698 was built there. It's no longer extant. And Barrack Street still remains where people will go to drink a lot, frankly. There's a lot of pubs on Barrack Street. And all of the commercial directories show that in the 19th century, pubs and public houses are intensely concentrated in areas around barracks. This is perhaps, not something that is going to surprise us. Soldiers have a reputation for drinking a lot, but that reputation, we have to see how it might actually form the economy of a garrison town. It's the same in Kilkenny. Around Kilkenny Barracks, there was a very strong concentration of pubs. And then when Cork City's new barracks, which still remains open today and in use by the Irish Army, they even get a new townland name called Barrackton, which replaces the Irish one, Glan Kitoin, which never made it into an English anglicized commonplace name. So it has really profound geographical effects. And then when they leave, when the barracks close or are destroyed, the renaming and the rebranding and the reuse of these spaces really brings forth reflections of cultural nationalism and attempts to articulate alternatives to these military cultures. In Fermoy, they rename Barrack Hill Oliver Plunkett Street. It doesn't catch on very much. People still call it Barrack Hill. They rename various streets after Columkill and Bridget and all of these, very good, worthy saints in an attempt to replace the cultural footprint that militarism had left on their town. But you could argue, North Cork and its obsession with horses and with steeplechasing, that really is a very strong legacy that was supported by the British military need for soldiers to have horses for cavalry officers, to have at least 2 mounts, official mounts, and then 2 others for hunting, and God knows how many other horses. So all of these ways are, I think, legacies that are, difficult maybe to see until you start conceptualizing a place as a garrison town. And then the physical buildings, some of them are still in use. As I said, Cork City is Collins Barracks and is still in use. But those towns that have ruined barracks, some of them have taken the interesting tactic of ignoring their existence altogether. So Buttevant in North Cork, if we ever pass through Buttevant, has a huge barrack complex on the outside and is rebranding itself tourist-wise as a Norman town, ignoring this really conspicuous piece of architecture that's just crying out for some sort of explanation. And then a lot of you might have been to Collins Barracks in Dublin, which is now the Museum of Decorative Arts. And that, of course, features a really good exhibition called Soldiers and Chiefs, which is about the imperial participation of Irish people, or it's an interesting way of approaching lots of complicated questions in one museum space. It's hard to summarize now that I try and put one sentence on it. But I think I'm really interested in the tension between people, describing historical events like this through people or through places, because the Irish soldier and the concept of the Irish martial identity is itself part of imperial propaganda. It is a way of integrating a form of Irish masculinity into the imperial story. And I suppose I just want to finish up by doing a tiny bit of critique on some of the stuff that I did in my previous paper. Even as I was doing it, I was thinking about it. I'm constantly trying to understand how to articulate the imperial experience through individuals that I come across in my research who turn out to have very compelling life stories. And throughout my talk, I spoke about Bridget Dowling, nee Kent, who had married into the army. And I use the word representative a lot. And sometimes I have problems with this, because for most of the people that go through the British Army, men, women, and children, it's very difficult to find anything more than fragments of their experience, whether they moved to India for a short time, whether they went to Egypt, whether they lived in barracks, whether they lived without. even if they were subject to court martial, because there are so many different types of court martial and records aren't kept for all types. So it's really a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare trying to find anybody. And so I sometimes struggle whether I am overimposing ideas of representation on the 1 or 2 people that I can actually get a good story out of. So I tried then to look at the places to see those common links that might go beyond individuals. The texture of individual lives, I find, resists generalization when you're talking about 1 out of millions. And the garrisons, armies, and empires, I think there are levels of the experience that men, women, and children had when they worked in the army. They experienced different levels of violence and different levels of institutionalization. And the compulsion, I think, also exists in institutional bureaucracy and their experience of a barrack as an institution. And I know there's a lot of work going on in institutions in Ireland right now, other types of institutions, ones that are associated with gender and with sexual immorality. But I think that barracks also offer a lot for us to think about. Just as an aside, I'm in Germany at the moment, where their barracks look completely different to the British model. They don't have high walls on the outside for a start, and appear not to have ever had high walls. So there are ways in which there are specific cultures of institutions as well. And part of the problem with studying barracks at home, of course, is it takes us away from the military as war, which is a very popular way of conceptualizing the British military imperial story, is about war and is about conflict. But within the home stations, they aren't at war, but they are part of a war machine. And I think the home stations are just as important in creating war and sustaining levels of war as the front line is, and as those great stories of, men trudging for hours through the desert and all of that. So I suppose, I think they're just some of the general points that I'd like to make about how the imperial experience can be democratized and also generalized when we look at garrison towns and barracks within them.
Thanks very much, Aoife. I'm going to ask David Reynolds to come in just a second, but I can't resist throwing in just a small family story. My grandfather, Jim Maloney, who's a Republican from Tipperary town, and I asked him, what games did you play as a kid? And he said, I played hurling. It's a tip sport, as you know, although the Cork sometimes make efforts at it. And he said, and soccer. I said, why did you play soccer? And he said, well, because all the kids in the streets in Tip Town played soccer, because it's a garrison town. And in fact, your fellow Corkonian, Dave Hannigan, has written a book, the Barracks Game or whatever, precisely about soccer, which of course remains, despite the GA, as a very popular sport. Okay, can I ask David to come in, please?
Well, thanks very much. I'm something of an outsider in this discussion in that I'm not particularly well versed in Irish history, but I share, I think, a feeling that is common to a number of participants in this festival, and certainly to the organizers, that it's important to develop more dialogue between the island of Ireland, with all its complexities, and Britain, with its own complexities. And that's why I wrote, in part of the reason I wrote Island Stories, out of a concern that the way that in England we were talking about our past and our relationships within these islands was a considerable simplification, to put it politely, of the kind of history I was familiar with. What I wanted to do today is just draw on a little of that book and the thinking behind it and the talk I gave, but to try and make a proposition and then about 3 points about this. The proposition is that I think the way that empire is thought of in England, and of course England covers a multitude of people and ideas, but I'm engaged in gross generalization. The English conception of empire is something that we did in the past, and it's now over. There was an empire. There was there were maps of the world with huge areas colored pink, but then that went. How did it go? A lot of discussion. We lost it. We gave it away. We transferred power. We lost the will to rule. Variety of explanations, but it's now a thing of the past. Almost like a suit of clothes that you've tried on for a while, it kind of fitted and then it didn't fit, so we got rid of it. We tried something different, that was called Europe, and that hasn't fitted very well, so 2016 we kind of got rid of that, and we're now, what are we in? We're global Britain or something. But I don't think pasts are shed in that sort of way. And I am quite clear that empire is fundamental to understanding the story of England. So let me explain or develop this in three ways. First of all, empire was integral to the history of these islands. Empire was integral to the history of these islands. That it was an empire project for the English kings, starting with the medieval English kings, and was continued by their successors, by the Tudors and so on. This is a story you're familiar with, to do with their expansionary instincts, and my own talk features the book of John Seeley, The Expansion of England, published in 1883, which was the story of how the English created Great Britain, and then they moved on across the seas to create Greater Britain. So it was part of an expansionary project, but also, if you like, a security project, because of the sense that they were not safe, the English polity, with its porous borders with Scotland and Wales, and with a problematic neighbour across the Irish Sea, unless they had full control of the islands. And certainly from the Elizabethan times, from Cecil, Lord Burleigh, they have that very strongly in their framework. So empire's integral to the history of these islands. Secondly, relations within these islands have been shaped by the changing character of Britain's global empire. Relations within these islands, between the various polities on these two islands, Island of Ireland and Island of Britain, have been shaped by the changing character of Britain's global empire. Now, Jane Ulmer, I think, gave us some fascinating insights into that for the early modern period. Let me just confine myself to the 20th century, a period that you are looking at closely in this festival is the period of the War of Independence and the Civil War. That is part of a global crisis of empire after the First World War. A crisis of empire in two ways. One is that British Empire expands to its largest extent because of the pickings from Germany, and particularly from the Ottoman Empire, acquired after 1918. But also, order and stability across the empire are challenged by the growth of strong nationalist movements as a result of the upheavals, the chaos of the war, and also the encouragement of other figures, for example, Woodrow Wilson in the United States. I'm thinking of Eris Manella's work about the Wilsonian moment. So that the crisis in Ireland, the War of Independence and the Civil War, are running simultaneously with crisis in India, civil disobedience in India, problems of holding down the new territories, Mesopotamia, Iraq, and also Egypt, at the heart of the pivot of the British Empire through the Suez Canal. So this is a large multiple crisis of empire. And as you well know, on the island of Ireland, it's something that splits the country in two. We talked yesterday, it was a fascinating conversation about how rigid and absolute was partition, but nevertheless, there are two states on the island of Ireland as a result of that crisis. The story in Britain is very different. The story of the impact of the Great War in Britain is very different. It's often forgotten, certainly in England, and I think more widely, that the Irish Home Rule crisis before the First World War for the Asquith government is also accompanied by a major Home Rule movement in Scotland. A Home Rule bill for Scotland, in fact, gets its second reading in the House of Parliament, in the House of Commons in 1913. There is also a strong movement of anti-English feeling in Wales, not so much expressed in political terms. There's not a strong Home Rule movement, but there is a very strong movement to establish the Anglican Church in Wales, which is, of course, a bastion of English landlord power. So the Home Rule crisis that you're familiar with in Ireland is replicated to some degree in Britain itself. And as we also heard, there is even discussion about how you should deal with this crisis through Home Rule all round. In other words, also devolution of power within England. So there's a sense of radical discussion about the United Kingdom in this period. But the consequence of the war, it seems to me, the Great War, is that it brings both Wales and Scotland back into the fold, into the Union. The experience of the Great War, of soldiers fighting in Welsh regiments, in Scottish regiments, for the British Empire, accentuates the sense of pride in their sacrifices as Welshmen, Scotsmen, but also a sense of being part of that British project. I saw something in the chat about the importance of empire as holding the Union together. I think that is absolutely fundamental. And what I'm saying is that it is reinforced. It's given a kick, a new kick in Wales and Scotland by the First World War and by the Second World War. So this is one example, I think, of the way in which changes within the wider British Empire and its project impact on relations within these islands. But the third point I want to make is that empire at home and abroad, my first 2 points, also has been critically dependent on England feeling a sense of a stable situation with regard to Europe, to events and situation on the continent of Europe. It is, after all, war with France that prompts the Acts of Union with Scotland in 1707 and Ireland in 1801. In both cases, they take place during a period of intense security crisis over France and France's predatory ambitions in these islands, and the decision that faute de mieux, a union is the best way to proceed, to hold the secure Scotland and then Ireland securely, is through a union. And also, of course, if you think of this in the, if you like, the interventionist side of things, consistently, English rulers have decided that despite their the security provided by their island position vis-a-vis the continent, it is nevertheless essential to intervene to maintain the balance of power on the continent of Europe. Elizabeth I supporting the Dutch revolt as an offset to Philip II's counter-reformation in Spain, the Duke of Marlborough commanding a joint English Habsburg army on the Danube, winning one of the most famous victories in British folklore, Battle of Blenheim in 1704. A different kind of alliance with the Prussians is crucial in the end to defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. So engagement with and the balance of power on the continent is crucial in order to ensure that there is a sufficiently stable relationship to allow the English to expand overseas. Overseas expansion depends on security and at home. And security at home is not just provided by the Navy, however important that is. It requires dealing with the continent of Europe. Okay, so this then, let's go back now to the story of how the 20th century unfolded. I talked about the divisive effects of the First World War in Ireland and the unifying effects on in Britain itself, reinforced by the Second World War. The story of the later part of the 20th century, it seems to me, if I move rather fast through the troubles in Ireland and the period up to the 1990s, what's interesting about the 1990s, it seems to me that you have two fundamental changes which the English have been extremely slow to appreciate in their full significance. The first is the creation of devolution parliaments in Scotland and Wales, 1999, which is a response to a variety of things, but one of them is to the waning of that, or the dissolution of that, if you like, imperial cement that had held Scotland and Wales comfortable within the Union project at home, because of the sense of being part of the British Empire, the benefits that were brought with that through trade and so on. The process of decolonization was a factor in the growing pressure for devolution, which was not strong in the earlier part of the 20th century. And then you have the Belfast Agreement, which does seem to me to be one of the most impressive pieces of international negotiation in the late 20th century. You will know better than I about the Irish sides of this. I was impressed by the role of two prime ministers of different parties, John Major and Tony Blair, in working at a thankless project, really, where the chances of success are very low. There's an enormous amount of very important work done by dedicated civil servants who really tried to understand Ireland in a different way. John Chilcot was mentioned yesterday, and I take my hat off to him as a very, very important figure in London. But there's various ways in which this agreement comes together. But it's absolutely fundamental, you know this better than I do, in terms of transforming the situation within the island of Ireland. And I, in my book, Island Stories, I turned this, for shorthand, the Millennium Settlement, the Millennium Settlement, devolution to Scotland and Wales, and the Belfast Agreement and its implications, Good Friday Agreement. The point that I also want to make is that although the European Union played very little role, as I understand it, in the negotiation and construction of the Belfast Agreement, it played a very significant role in helping to bed it down. Because both the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland had joined the European Union in 1973, they were both eligible for, this whole project was eligible for structural funds, regional territorial cooperation funds of various kinds. And it was very important that that money was provided quietly and supportively. Also, the common membership of the European Union created a kind of safe space for these developments to happen. And that was fundamental. The European Union project, or the European integration project, it's worth remembering, has been hugely important for border regions across a continent that has fought itself to a standstill for several centuries. A lot of European money has gone into projects for border security and border amelioration and creation of cross-border relationships. So you can see where this is going. It's going to 23rd of June, 2016. A referendum decision to leave the European Union. A referendum decision that I think it's fair to say few people had expected, and certainly nobody involved on either of the campaigning sides had done any preparation for. David Cameron forbade contingency plans. I think there's no evidence that Boris Johnson and Michael Gove woke up the following morning at 4 or 5 a.m. and had any idea what the hell they were going to do. And the next 5 years, right up to now, as you can well see, and Ireland has been a prime example of this, has been a case of making it up as you go along. So what I'm suggesting is that this, of course, has implications for what the Prime Minister calls our indestructible union. Obviously, in the case of Scotland, and also in the case of Northern Ireland and its relationship with the rest of Ireland.
David, can I cut in there, because can I just ask you to just bring your comments to a close, because
yes, I've got one more sentence actually.
Thanks.
So that,
sorry for delaying you.
I think I'll leave it there. I'm quite happy to leave it there.
Okay, thanks very much, and sorry for having to interrupt. I minded one thing before we go on to questions and so on. If I could make just a small point, a very good friend of mine, the late Brian Stewart, whose son Rory is probably better known, but Brian is an utter Scottish unionist, but he was outraged beyond measure when the Scottish regiments were, as it were, abolished and amalgamated and so on. And that links to the point you made, David, about the importance in building the internal empire of particularly Britain's military identity. I think it was an interesting point. Okay, I'm going to go hand over to our host Simon, who's fielding questions and so on. So can I hand over to you, Simon?
Absolutely, and I mean there are a couple there. Most recent one from Thomas Dempsey on whether you think, and maybe this is one for David, the sort of the unwritten nature of the British Constitution is part of what's made it vociferous at the moment. Whether with a different constitutional and voting system, things might have been different.
Well, I think they might have been, but the idea of going to a written constitution now seems to me to be utopian. I mean, Gordon Brown, for example, who has thought a lot and anguished a lot about the state of the United Kingdom, he has written a lot recently, and I go along with him on a lot of the diagnosis of dysfunctionalism. But then I stop when he says, well, we need to have a constitutional convention or some kind of thing like that, which I think would, be in the sort of the parlance of these kind of royal commissions. It would take minutes and spend years and get nowhere. What I think is going to need to happen is a recognition of dysfunctionality, and also an attempt, ideally, to work in ways which are less simply bipolar, us and them on this or that. That's why I was very struck yesterday by the reference that Paul Bew made to this paper by John White about the permeability of the Irish-UK border. The fact that despite partition, there were an awful lot of cross-border associations and projects carrying on. And what I was mentioning with the European Union was the same kind of process was facilitated. And it seems to me that England and Wales, England and Scotland work relatively well when they are not, their relationships are not high profile in tabloid newspapers and where people are playing political points. My view in writing island stories, and I didn't have a strong one before I started, is that certainly within Britain, the Union is the least bad way of living together on an island, which after all, it's, you talk about the bloodshed on the island of Ireland, it's been pretty bloody in the last millennium on the island of Britain, particularly between England and Scotland. So I would say it works as long as it's a more devolved kind of project. And that's why I've emphasized this so-called millennium settlement, because it seemed to me it was getting there. There was more wriggle room coming about. And that's part of why I feel so strongly about the tragedy of the Leave vote, an a Leave vote whose implications were never thought through. The effect within Britain and the effect in Ireland is very difficult. But my answer would be not trying to invent a written constitution.
And there have been a couple of questions from Mary coming back to your early comments about the role of the, as it were, those who were building an empire of souls, on whether your characterization was strictly fair. I mean, and the most recent one on the role of religious in supporting and encouraging anti-colonial movements.
Well, I think I think the points are fairly made, but I think there is a shift over time in the way that Irish missionary orders of all persuasions see the world and see their mission. I mean, the Columbans now are absolutely radical in terms of anti-colonialism, in terms of not even the younger ones, most of them in terms of issues of gender within the Catholic Church, in terms of the green agenda, you name it. They've gone completely, as the Daily Telegraph would regard it, as completely wokey. So that's one point. The other point, it's again fairly fair point to say that people like Kenneth Conda was educated by Methodists. Robert Mugabe was educated, I can't remember by who, but I'm pretty sure it's by a Catholic order, and so on. But it was in a sense a process of transition initially. Certainly the Columbans, if you look at the early years and their early narratives, they saw themselves as having a sort of a Catholic civilizing mission rather than as working with the people and so on, which is how they now see their world. But I think, I mean, obviously Mary's right to pull me up in terms of too gross a generalization. Thank you.
I guess I also wonder, I mean, to David's point about there being a value in dialogue between historians in Ireland and Britain about things we've chosen to forget. What, and I was going to, John is asking a question, but I was going to bring John Horn in. What might the value be of addressing this amnesia about, in particular, the withdrawal from empire and some of the things that, as he was hinting at in the first panel, the British sort of consistently seem to forget about wars of withdrawal. What might the value be, and how might you go about doing it in a way that was valuable rather than destructive, if that isn't too broad a question?
Yes, I'm not quite clear what the question's getting at, but let me make a stab at a response. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about the festival, and certainly the sessions I've joined in, is this sense, you know, we're talking about empire as a historical reality for, I think Jane Olmar said this very well, you know, for most of the last couple of millennia, if not more, except for the 20th century, when the position of empire has been debated and fundamentally changed. And of course, if we're talking about decolonization within that kind of narrative, if you like, a post-colonial narrative, then what we're, you know, what the retreat from empire, the withdrawal from empire, is unquestionably a good thing, and one that the moral weight is definitely in that direction. If we can, whatever we think of that, I mean, I entirely agree with it, but if we think about it more as historians, I think, and say that the withdrawal from empire, the end of empire, is a general experience across the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century particularly, and into the second half for some of the remaining European powers, then we're talking about a common set of experiences that were not about just dropping a past and then moving on, but in all major European powers, there has been an influx of former colonial subjects into the home countries, into the metropole, which is fundamentally changing the demographic character of the country through intermarriage, changing fertility rates, and all the rest of it. So I think in the case of the United Kingdom, it's anticipated that Caucasians will be only 2/3 of the population by 2050 because of the mixing of races and so on. So that it seems to me that there is a set of common experiences for many countries. Now, I don't know how this maps onto the Irish experience, but of course, what this whole conference has been about is how complex the Irish experience of empire has been, both as a recipient and as agents in the whole process. But it seems to me that withdrawal from empire is an issue that could be discussed in terms of its historical consequences, as well as its moral significance.
Margaret, it'd be interesting. I was going to get you to answer John Horn's question, but maybe you had something else you wanted to.
Well, I was going to say, as an historian, we keep using terms like the home front or the home. I mean, are we actually saying that Ireland was part of running the British Empire? I mean, is that a new consensus we're moving towards? Because I'm profoundly uncomfortable with it. I don't think it's historically borne out. If you go through the high political papers throughout the 19th century, I'm perfectly happy to agree that Irish individuals played roles. But I mean, I really think we seem to be moving very significantly in a particular direction based on limited evidence.
And to John's point, do you think the current isolation of Northern Unionism is a result, and in a way it's an endorsement of what you've just said, of it being the last bit of the British Empire?
What do you mean?
That contrary to the idea that Ireland was part of running the British Empire, it was in fact and remained a colony. That's the slightly.
I wouldn't go so far as to say, you know, once you have the structure of the United Kingdom from 1801, the structure of that polity requires that certain equalities introduced for the purposes of the wider polity per se affect everybody within it. So that democratizes Irish politics to a degree. It allows for the growth of kind of Catholic middle class, you know, those who do Indian civil service exams. It's all kinds of effects that are different to the pre-union position. But I mean, I think to suggest that if you look at Dublin Castle, if you look at Irish administrations, if you look at the period for which habeas corpus is suspended through the 19th century, if you go in detail through the political papers of anyone from Peel to Gladstone, it is preposterous to suggest that the Irish are somehow running the empire like partners. It's baloney. And I think the use of the term like the home front for this island is completely inappropriate and quite worrying. And I totally disagree with it, actually. It's just wrong.
Well, I think you find that the army do call it the home stations.
I don't care what the army call it. I care what we call it.
But it is an important reality for the British military complex.
For the British military complex, yes.
Yes, but it's part of that. It doesn't mean the Irish are administering it. It just means that they are integral to the success of the British Army as an imperial police force. And
well, the Irish are, look, Irish Catholics are admitted into the British Army in the late 18th century because they need manpower. So the poorest social class in Ireland do provide manpower disproportionately to the British Army in the first 3 or 4 decades of the 19th century, as do the Scots. But if you look at the social and economic conditions of Ireland in that period, really, it ain't that surprising. There aren't that many other jobs. You know, I disagree with one thing, which is that you can write social history without suddenly shifting the political actualities of a period, in my opinion. Do you know what I mean? Like the social history of the barracks is unaffected really by whether or not it is British run or Irish incorporated, isn't it? I mean, the social history of those places is the social history of those places. And it's an interesting social history to tell. But to leap from that to the presumption that because such entities existed for, I don't know the politics of how they were structured on the island at the time, to conclude from that Ireland somehow participated in the British Empire. I mean, you know, it was conquered, it was forcibly brought into the Union by bribery and corruption in 1801. Every single administration of Ireland talks about its peculiarity, the appallingness of the population, how abnormal they are by English standards, how they need to be incorporated into some form of civilized life. I mean, decade after decade, this goes on. So the people running the British government, the Lord Lieutenant, the Chief Secretary, they don't think Ireland is a normal part of
But Aoife's not arguing that, Margaret.
No, I agree. I said I agree with the social history of barracks towns being a really important point. I make a separate point about the high politics and the politics of who runs, owns, or controls policy in the 19th century. And as an extension of that, no, I think Aoife thought I was insulting her work because I was very skeptical about the home phrase. Do you know what I mean?
But just another thing, though, again, in relation to the high politics, if you like, very explicitly in 1914, two things happened. One is obviously the Ulster crisis, which was the Curragh crisis, was completely forgotten. We ran a conference, you spoke at it on the Curragh, on the centenary, but in Britain there was not a mention of the biggest crisis in civil military relations for 300 years. Because we don't mention those kind of wars. But the other one is that in 1914, the leader of Irish nationalism explicitly, rightly or wrongly, makes a commitment, wherever the firing line extends, which is why my half great uncle joins the British Army, and his three younger brothers half brothers end up in the IRA.
Okay, but
so there is a conscious, positive political thing from Irish nationalism in 1914 in relation to the Great War.
Well, I mean, probably the reason
interrupting.
you have a revolution is because the revolutionary believe that the place almost is being successfully incorporated into the polity at that time. I'm not disputing that at the end of the 19th or early 20th century. Redmond is unusual in the extent of his commitment to imperialism by Irish parliamentary party standards, I think.
Well, it sounds like that's the subject for another debate, whether there's consensus that that's true. But I do think what's interesting about the course of the discussion is that we, in a way, come back to this idea about, whether something that was a normal in the sense of having been a normalized part of Irish experience has been forgotten. Because it seemed to me that the central force of Aoife's work is that this is something that we have collectively chosen to ignore, whether we think it was a good thing or a bad thing, whether we think it was justifiably regarded as the home front or not, or whether, as I think John is hinting at in his comment in the chat, there's a degree of ambiguity about this. But I think
my only problem is with the term home.
Yeah, can I mention also the remarkable parallel? If you read the narratives of Indian separatists who have been in the British Indian Army, there's an extraordinary congruence in the few that I've read with Irish takes on service in the British Army, and of a combination of affection and of we were the tools of our imperial masters.
Isn't that what empires do? They incorporate local elites and they use the local.
And not only local elites, they incorporate in the Punjab, the people who couldn't, the younger sons of small farms and so on and so on. But that's a separate matter. Sorry, I interrupted again, Simon. I'll try and shut up.
No. All I'm conscious of is that we have hit our time, but clearly not done comprehensive justice, not through any fault of yours, but rather through the passage of time to these subjects. I hope we can return to some of them, and I am very grateful to all four of you for being willing to take what was such a broad and inchoate suggestion from us and to make it into such an interesting discussion. So on behalf of all of the people in the audience, I'd like to thank all four of you, and I'd hope that we can see you in person at a future festival to pick up different bits of this, because I think there are two or three really quite distinct strands emerging at the end for us to chew on in future. And I just remind everyone that the final live event of the festival will be in 28 minutes with Fergal Keane talking about what we choose to remember and how. So it's still possible to register for that.